All right. Good afternoon, everyone. As you know, we're just on the cusp of International Women's Day, and we're very pleased to have with us several guests, including in the center, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, the Executive Director of UN Women. To her left, you have Silke Staab, who is part of the research division of UN Women. And to her right, you have Anya Victoria Delgado of the Feminist Alliance for Rights. And so I believe they'll all make some opening remarks before we go to questions. Ms. Mlambo-Ngcuka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank you. Thank you very much for being here today at the start of what we now try to claim to be International Women's Month. The International Women's Day is coming on the 8th, on Sunday. But we will observe it tomorrow here at the United Nations. And we mark the fact that 2020 is a big year for women with many commemorations, marking the 25 years of implementing the Beijing Platform, the 20 years of implementing Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. It is the 10th birthday of UN Women, and of course it is also the 75 years of the UN. We celebrate this year's International Women's Day with the theme, I am Generation Equality, Realizing Women's Rights. And we will be hoping in somehow scaled down way to bring together many women in different parts of the world where they can congregate, but this is left to the health conditions permitting. We will, however, in terms of the context of the discussion, we want to bring together the generations of gender equality activists with visionary feminists, with new insights, and making sure that we both affirm the Beijing Platform for action, but at the same time, we move forward addressing the new changes. At the event itself here at the UN, which again will be now scaled down, we will have change makers drawn within the community of New York who are young, but also we'll have the change makers who were in Beijing and will make the connection of their journey. We will have the Secretary General addressing us. We'll have a Nobel Peace Laureate, Mrs. Leima Bowe, and we will have youth panelists and some entertainment. So even though the season is a bit, we are in down spirits, we will try to make sure that we inject a spirit of celebration as well as reflection. The CSW, as you know, has also been scaled down. On Monday, we will have a one-day meeting, which will only be sitting for the purpose of adopting the political declaration, and the participants will be mainly member states and the civil society that lives here in New York and is accredited to the UN and to ECOSOC. We are urging everyone to do their best to observe the prevention measures and all of the public health announcements that have been issued to all of us. And then, of course, today we launch this report, and I'm proud to say that this report has enjoyed significant input of member states as well as civil society in countless meetings in all regions. There were 170 member states who submitted national reports and hundreds of civil society who also contributed to the national and regional reviews. And that is what gave us the report, which they will explain. The report shows that we have made some progress in the last 25 years, but it also highlights the fact that progress has been made in those areas where there has been targeted investment. by member states, and this is in particular in health and education. Where we still have challenges in those areas, it is not out of lack of trying. You can see that the investments made a difference. But otherwise, women are squeezed into a quarter of the space. We have 75% of lawmakers and parliamentarians being men. We have 73% of managerial positions held by men. We have 70% of climate negotiators, also men. And when it comes to peacemakers, it's even less, even though we know that when women participate significantly, it also guarantees peace that lasts longer. So we are urging in this commemoration this year for an urgent change, for acceleration and participation of women. We see still, even within these conditions, the possibility to change and the possibility to move forward, and we want to seize those opportunities, and that include making sure that we engage a much broader stakeholders. We see the surge in feminist movements and civil society activism around the world, in particular that is led by UN Women, making a change because of the radical impatience that they exhibit, which is taking us forward. We will be able to complement the work of member states, which will be started in CSW, in order to make the push forward. We will complement this work through Generation Equality, which is a civil society-led event, which will kickstart in Mexico in May this year and in Paris in July. And through the action to be taken at Generation Equality, we will be able to reinforce member states and together to take the work forward. We also will celebrate the Security Council Resolution 1325 in October at the Security Council, and that too will bring together activists as well as member states to mark this important commemoration. We will also mark the 5 years of the implementation of SDGs, and we'll pull all these issues together. I want to thank the team that has put together the report, and I want to hand over for more details of what is contained in the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about this report. Our executive director already mentioned that we have seen some progress, but overall the report finds that progress has been unacceptably slow. So what I want to do is give you 3 concrete examples of areas where we see concerning signs of stagnation. And this will be, I'm afraid, mainly bad news, so bear with me. I promise to finish on a more positive note. There has been very little progress on women's economic empowerment. Globally, the gender gap in labor force participation has stagnated over the past 20 years. Today, less than 2/3 of women are in the labor force compared to more than 90% of men. Meanwhile, of course, women continue to shoulder the bulk of unpaid care and domestic work. Without access to affordable childcare services, many see their labor market opportunities stifled when they become mothers. The resulting economic hardship can be profound. As we show in the report, the gender gap in poverty is widest during key child-rearing years. Women aged 25 to 34 are 25% more likely to live in extreme poverty than men. Violence against women continues unabated. Nearly 1 in 5 women have faced violence by an intimate partner over the past 12 months. Most countries, which is encouraging, now have laws against domestic abuse, but implementation and enforcement remains weak. Women's powerful collective action has recently given us cause for celebration, but it is also a fact that for most women around the world, access to justice remains elusive. In addition, we see that new technologies are fueling new forms of violence, such as cyber harassment, for which policy solutions are largely absent. This kind of violence is also a particular problem for women in politics, who are too often hounded out of the political sphere. Despite progress on maternal health, women's sexual and reproductive rights remain far from realized. In fact, the proportion of women with unmet need for family planning has remained unchanged since 2000. Today, 190 million women who want to avoid pregnancy lack the means to do so. That is 190 million women who do not have control over their own bodies. Teenage pregnancy has declined, but it is still a huge issue, especially for poor girls in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. Meanwhile, comprehensive sexuality education and the right of adolescent girls to remain in school when they're pregnant are being challenged. So you can see that even 25 years after Beijing, there are a lot of challenges that remain to be addressed. What is particularly worrying is that the context for accelerating progress is not nearly as promising as it was in 1995, when hopes for democratization, peace, and global cooperation were flying high. Today, there is a sense that the gains of development have not been shared equally, that power and wealth are concentrated at the top, while economic insecurity remains for many at the bottom. And this sense has also fueled exclusionary, misogynist, and xenophobic groups that are threatening democratic values and institutions. This has gone hand in hand, as we know, with pushback against some hard-won gender equality gains. Conflict and humanitarian crises since 1995 have become more complex and protracted, leaving women and girls more vulnerable than ever before. The global climate emergency is the biggest crisis that humanity has ever faced, and it already is taking a disproportionately negative toll on the most vulnerable women and girls who have least contributed to the crisis. So now that I have thoroughly depressed you all, I also want to say that change is possible. Working on this report, I've been struck time and again by the determination and innovation with which countries in diverse regions are trying to push forward. Latin America, for example, is one of the few regions where women's labor force participation has in fact increased over the last 20 years. Countries like Chile and Uruguay have boosted childcare coverage because they have recognized that women's economic empowerment will not become a reality if families are lacking this kind of support. This has allowed them to catch up or even leapfrog some developed countries where childcare coverage has stagnated. Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the regions where access to family planning remains woefully inadequate, but it is also home to two of the countries that have made the fastest progress on women's access to contraception, Ethiopia and Rwanda. These two countries have invested in health infrastructure, they've trained staff, they've reached out to women in rural areas, and these are precisely the kind of measures that will also strengthen their preparedness for global health crises, like the one we're facing today. What is needed now is a concerted drive to scale up, expand, and deepen policies and programs that can move the needle on women's rights to the benefit of all. And another reason for optimism in this regard is the surge in women's activism that we've seen across the globe and that has picked up steam in recent years. Energized by young feminists at the helm, social movements are challenging piecemeal progress and proposing brave new alternatives. World leaders can learn from the way in which these movements work across silos. For many of them, the fight for gender equality is inseparable from broader struggles for economic, environmental, and social justice. And so that's also why I'm really thrilled that today we have here with us Anya Victoria, an amazing activist from Mexico. He is also leading the work of the Feminist Alliance for Rights, which is a very important coalition of organizations at the front line of advocacy and accountability for gender equality. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be here to reflect on this important report. I want to start by saying that from the very founding of the United Nations, feminist and women's organizations have been and remain the driving force of progress on gender equality. The gains, while many, have proven fragile indeed. In the current climate of pushback, we are seeing attempts to close off spaces that allow us to speak up and amplify our voices in defense of women's rights. Across the globe, women's human rights defenders are rallying to protect hard-won gains, often putting their lives on the line. I am here today to say we will not give up, and we need the international community to stand with us. Young feminist activists have always played an important role in our movements by bringing up new issues, ideas, and strategies. Today, they are pushing us to act with urgency and take bolder approaches. But young women activists face many barriers. They need greater access to funding and capacity building opportunities. They also need to know that they are safe when they speak up for women's rights. The report notes important areas of progress, but it leaves no doubt that in every field, women continue to be in a worse position than men, simply because they are women. The rise and convergence of fundamentalist, authoritarian, and populist forces have had a negative impact on efforts to achieve gender equality. They have used different tactics in multiple spaces to challenge established international standards on women's rights and are attempting to reinterpret them in ways that negate and exclude women's experiences. Some governments are questioning the very notion of a gender perspective and are misleadingly characterize it as an ideology that is purportedly opposed to traditional or family values. This is having a devastating impact on women's access to their sexual and reproductive health and rights. We will not be silenced. We will not tolerate laws that aim to restrict our collective action. We will not accept repression with impunity. We are working strategically to move forward against the odds. Cross-regional networks like the Feminist Alliance for Rights play an important role here. Taking an intersectional approach, we are amplifying the voices of women from the Global South and also from those marginalized communities in the Global North. These include young, differently able, indigenous, migrant, refugee, lesbian, transgender women. We are strengthening their leadership to influence global norms and processes, and we work hard at the regional and national level to hold powerful actors accountable for women's human rights. In relation to Beijing Plus 25, we are working with thousands of activists around the world to advance a feminist and women's movement action plan that places women's human rights and feminist values at the center. In doing so, we are breaking silos and we are building new alliances across movements to achieve bold and transformative change. We were also looking forward for the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, an important international space for feminist analysis and exchange. The cancellation of all side parallel events have been deeply disappointing. As civil society organizations who are directly affected by this situation, we not only want to be informed about the next steps. Actually, we are demanding to be part of the decision-making process with meaningful representation. We need guarantees that while this opportunity has been lost, others will be open, and soon. In conclusion, feminist and women's organizations continue to believe in the power of international agreements and organizing. In this time of crisis and transition, we need UN agencies, human rights mechanisms, and the international community to stand with us in the quest for justice and human rights for all. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll now open up the floor for questions. Please indicate to whom you're directing your question. Yes, Edie.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. We appreciate it. I have two questions. One on the statistics behind all of the statistics in this report. Where did they come from? And secondly, to Phumzile, it has been said that the real key to achieving gender equality is changing the attitudes of men. What is UN Women doing on this score, looking ahead to the future, especially in light of efforts to growing exclusionary politics, misogyny, xenophobia, and returning to traditional values?
So on the first question about the statistics, most of the data in the report comes from official UN statistics, and it's the most recent data that is available in these global databases. But we're very lucky to have here also the expert that has led all the work on the statistics that are in the report, Jeanette Ascona. I don't know if you would like to say a few more words about this.
By your seat.
Oh.
There's one just there.
Didn't know we had this here. Yeah, so the data comes from the custodian agencies within the UN who are responsible for collecting this data. So if you're looking at data on education, it's coming from UNESCO. If we're looking at labor force statistics, it's coming from the ILO. Of course, the original source of the data are the countries themselves. The international agencies harmonize the data so that we can compare countries and compare apples to apples, if you will. So that's the source of the data. If you have very specific questions on some of the country analysis and the regional analysis, we're happy to provide after the briefing.
And if I may add, we thought that it was quite commendable that 170 countries actually took the time to write the reports and to submit the reviews of their own countries, including the countries that were not in Beijing. So they've hopped into the bus along the way. So we really appreciated that cooperation with the member states. Of course, there were very few who were not in Beijing, but it's still nice to know that there's a buy-in even after the Beijing Platform was adopted. They've been adopting along the way, so to say. What are we doing about men? Of course, we are working together with the other organizations that engage men and boys, like Men Engaged, but we also have our own campaign, He for She, that engages men and boys, men in leadership, men with privilege, because they make decisions, they set the trend, they can lower the ambition for change, they can open up and accelerate change. So we engage them at high level. At grassroots level, we are now starting to work through our offices programmatically in our offices to engage men and to help them to create their own organizations, spaces where they can also pledge solidarity and take action to support gender equality. We work with traditional chiefs, especially in Africa, where the institution is still very strong and very influential. We have now helped to create what is becoming an all-Africa organization of traditional leaders who stand for gender equality. In particular, we engage them on ending child marriage, FGM, and violence against women, which are the areas where they tend to have a strong influence. We work with religious leaders of all the religions, because even within those institutions, there are people who are trying to create change, and they also want the possibility to work with other people. In private sector, we work especially with advertisers, because they tend to set the trend on projecting stereotype both about men and women. We have an alliance called Unstereotype Alliance, which works on changing the stereotypes, as well as sanctioning those who sustain stereotypes and encouraging those who are making change. Thank you.
So my question is for the Executive Director, Sherman Bryce-Pease, South African Broadcasting. Given the economic benefit of closing the gender gaps and achieving gender equality and women's empowerment, I think McKinsey came out with a report in 2015 that said $12 trillion could be added to global GDP by 2025 if these benchmarks were attained. So given the economic benefit to countries, both globally, nationally, why do you feel, what's your assessment as to why the uptake of the prescriptions post-Beijing has been so slow? And can you point to regions where, best practice has been achieved that other regions should be emulating? Where should we be watching? Which region is doing the best on these issues?
I'm going to allow you to answer first, and then I will come. Because maybe we could back up with the statistics, yeah.
Yes, I'll try to pick up on what seem to be multiple questions. I think the economic benefit and the broader benefit for societies and families of investing in gender equality is clear. And we've shown this also in specific areas. It's interesting you should ask, because precisely for South Africa, we've carried out calculations on childcare service expansion. If South Africa expanded childcare services, free childcare services to all children under 5, it could create up to 3 million new jobs, which is really relevant for a country where unemployment is high, right? And a lot of these jobs would also go to women. So I think the case has been made. What we see is that across regions, there are promising examples. I think Latin America on childcare is a region where other regions can really learn from. But we've also seen promising examples in other regions. So, for example, legal discrimination remains an important barrier to women across the world, but we've seen recently that progress in some areas in North Africa and the Middle East in terms of marital rape laws being reformed. So I think there's lots of cross-regional learning to be done.
What would seem to be common sense that because there is so much benefit in addressing these issues and bringing gender equality, you would expect that countries would just take it up and make the difference. The deep stereotypes about women, the prejudice that exists about women, the misogyny that has increased, unfortunately, the rhetorics from leaders also, and the fact that the legislation that perpetuates discrimination, even though it has changed, there's still a lot that still remains. So a combination of all these facts has made the progress to be painfully slow. And thanks to the radical, impatient young feminists, they are helping us to make the case to move faster and to scale up the size of change.
Thank you very much for the briefing. My question, it's Pamela Falk from CBS News. My question for the ED is, in addition to some of the areas where sexual violence has increased and other issues in other parts of the world as well, there was an interesting part of the report that talked about gender-based violence and cyber harassment that said that the European Union had 1 in 10 women report having experienced cyber harassment since the age of 15. Do you think part of the issue on cyber harassment in particular has to do with the internet, and that's hurt women? And to our young feminist, Anya Victoria, can you say something about the next generation? Is there much more energy? Is there more energy now to take up the fight and pursue it with the pushback that's going on? Thank you.
Yes, unfortunately, the internet is both a blessing and a curse. It has given us economies so much, but also it has created serious changes. The cyberbullying and harassment that you find on the internet is made possible because it is anonymous. so people are emboldened in the anonymity. It also is very difficult to hold people responsible for their actions online, so people do get away with all of this. And in some kind of a warped way, people enjoy the instant, I can't say fame, but the instant recognition that they get out of these actions of trolling and embarrassing other people. But the lack of consequences for their action, the hiding behind where you cannot be faced and be challenged for your action has actually created the possibility for people to do this repeatedly. And this is the challenges that governments and regulators are facing on how to address and deal with these issues. And we do hope that we are moving into a phase where we will in earnest look at ways in which this could be addressed effectively. We're not there yet.
Thank you. Thank you. So definitely, I think that as some spaces are being closed or others are being open, and I've seen, especially in my region, Latin America, I've seen how many women's organizations, feminist organizations, are developing strategies to push back the pushback. So we are trying to open spaces in other not traditional areas. We are out on the street. We are organizing marches, which, that's traditional, but we are also bringing new songs, new dance steps. We are using internet, that it has this both negative and positive side. So now the reach of internet is great, and I've seen that as many of these new movements are being led by young women, these are open spaces, and I think is also multi-generational, and that's something very positive, that we've been able to find those new spaces where women can bring their experiences and knowledge, and younger women can bring the new ideas, strategies. And is the only way we are going to be able to respond or to resist and to change, transform what we are facing. And coming from Mexico, where every day 10 women are being killed, more than 300 women every month, this is especially important to not only to focus on what can we do internally, but also to build bridges with women's organizations in other parts in Latin America and to join voices.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azim from the Daily Arabic Al Arabi Al Jadid. So my question has two parts. It's about the Middle East and the Arab countries specifically. And which trends are you seeing there when it comes also to countries and setbacks when it comes to countries that faced wars and conflict in the last years? And the second part of the question regarding refugee camps or situation or in different countries where you have a lot of refugees and migrants from these countries, whether the international organizations, UN and others, can play a role there to, thank you.
Thank you for the question. It is, of course, a fact that conflicts have become more widespread, more protracted, and so on. And it is also a fact that this means that in those countries affected by conflict, including in the regions that you mentioned, women and girls fare worse across a range of outcomes, whether it's higher maternal mortality rates, violence, child marriage often increases in these contexts. So that is something that I think is widely recognized. What is less recognized is the role women play in conflict resolution and in peace building at an everyday level in these countries. at the community level, negotiating ceasefires, negotiating pathways for humanitarian aid to come in, and so on. And at the same time, women remain excluded from formal peace tables, as Edie had already said, 13% of negotiators, 4% of signatories. I mean, that's really deplorable and something that we would need to see change on, and also need to see change on for peace to last in countries and the regions that you mentioned.
I think the one positive trend that I can highlight in the Middle East is the change in legislation. Still not fast enough, but moving the right direction. I think one of the significant changes is the ending of the so-called marry or rapist legal dispensation, which has been something that everyone was working for. We still have a long way to go, and parliamentarians in all of those countries are working with the different advocates in trying to change the legislation. But I must not pretend also that the norms and culture and religion is enabling. That still is another side of struggle that we need to engage. But if you have the laws, then you have recourse against the groups that are not accepting the laws. Not a walk in the park, but there is determination also amongst the women. The UN's work in refugee camps and so on, definitely the whole UN system works in all those situations. But again, it gets complicated every day. The number of people who are destitute, who need assistance, who need humanitarian support has just increased to a number that has never been seen before. So yes, the UN system is there, but it is hard, and the UN has been able in humanitarian to raise much more money than ever before, but the needs have increased much more. So it's kind of like a running target that we are dealing with. Thanks.
Thank you for the press briefing. My name is Issa Juf Campbell for Africa in Harlem. I would be interested in hearing more about Black African women, the case of African women, and maybe here also women of African descent living in North America.
You want to answer first? Well, in the case of Africa, on one end, and let me say just women and girls in Africa, we highlight a lot the progress that has been made in maternal health as well as in education, because we have seen the increase of the number of girls who are in school, and we've seen an increased number of women who get attention of medical professionals when giving birth, who also, we've also seen the decrease of maternal deaths. But the fact that, and decrease not just in Africa, overall, the decrease was 38% of maternal deaths between 2000 and 2019, 2008 and 2019, I think, yeah. So that has been good for Africa. The fact that Ethiopia, for instance, has done so well in addressing maternal health has also been because of policy and efforts. I think what you can take about Africa is that it is not impossible to bring about change. Where governments have tried, have allocated resources, we've actually seen the change. But also we've seen that where there is political will, like in Rwanda, you can see that the increase of women in leadership is possible. We also noted that countries that have gender-equal cabinets, some of them who are governments with feminist foreign policy, they are 12, how many in the world?
14?
There are 14, yeah, 14, and 4 of them are in Africa. So, you know, you have extremes. somewhere there's been progress, and we can see that the space for progress is opening, but also there's somewhere there is stagnation. In ending child marriage and FGM, we've seen policies, we've seen laws, we've seen progress, but it is slow. We've seen advocates increasing. Young women are playing a significant role in building movement in Africa, in leadership and participation. We've also seen a movement growing. We have the African Women's Leadership Network, which we are also associated with, which is pushing for leadership and participation of women. So it's a mixed bag, let me put it that way.
Stefano?
Just a small point for information on the report regarding your question. The theme of multiple and intersecting inequalities, and that the fact that women who stand at these intersections face much worse outcomes across many areas, is really a theme that runs through the report. We haven't consulted the statistics on the US for this report, but I'm sure they are available. Race and ethnicity is one of the dimensions that compounds women's disadvantage in many, many countries. Thank you.
Yes, Stefano Vaccara, Radio Radicale in Rome, La Voce di New York. And in a very recent report by the Organization for Cooperation and Economic Development in Paris, they presented a report after a high-level conference talking about intimate partner violence. And they talks about a global pandemic, probably a real pandemic here. The data, they say, is practically 1/3 of the women in the world had intimate partner violence. And they, like usually doesn't happen in those rooms, but there in Paris they indicate countries, they call it by name. A country that is on the top of the list, for example, is Argentina. It's based on the women denouncing the phenomenon. So maybe that the women are brave to go. And so my question is, because I see here, I see here some of your data of ever partner women and girls age 15 to 49 have experienced physical or sexual violence. You say 18% in the last 12 months. It looks like, because they say practically 1/3, you say 18%. But I want to ask you specifically this question. They, in their report in Paris a few weeks ago, they said that without resolving this problem, any policy, any politic, any talking of gender equality in any other field is useless. What do you think about that?
Let her give the facts first, but I agree with that conclusion.
Just as a clarification on the data points, the 18% are over the past 12 months, and the 1/3 is over the whole lifetime. So these are two different reference points, and hence two different data points.
And sorry, just a follow up is because I mentioned Argentina, but what is astonishing about this report, at least for me that was reading, is not they don't mention the usual country, the country that you expect. That there is, United States is the 3rd in the list on top. And then there are Denmark, country like Denmark is present. So just would like to have a reaction from you.
Violence against women is a global pandemic. It happens in every country. The fact that the OECD report has highlighted Argentina, just does not surprise me. It also would not have surprised me if it was any country in the Pacific, in Africa, in Europe, in here, because it is so prevalent. It is not a case of being a rich country or a poor country. This is one thing that happens in every society, in every class, in every culture. And in fact, we argue that if it was men who were being beaten up, I bet we would have seen something happening. It is not being treated with the seriousness that it deserves. It's also a public health crisis, because of the complications that it creates to women's health. It's an economic crisis because of the resources that it drains from women. And of course, more than anything else, it is the worst violation of human rights of women and girls.
And on that note, if we have no further questions, I'd like to thank our guests, and we look forward to marking the International Women's Day. And thanks very much.